Hello and welcome there to another episode of the Cliff Notes podcast, where we talk about the people, places and technology framing manufacturing today. Today I've been joined by Phil Williams, who's a historian and author, and previously we had on chatting about his book, How Britain Shaped the Manufacturing World, but now he's out with a follow-up with Vehicles to Vaccines. Quest to discover what happened to British manufacturing after 1951. Hello again, Phil.
Hello and good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you. How are we finding you today, and what's inspired you to put pen to paper again and pen another volume?
Okay, so it all comes back to where I started, which was doing some exploration of how the British Army was supplied in the two world wars. I did this from an archive that my father kept, and it really engrossed me. But the thing I found time and time again were the names of British companies that really had done astonishing things towards the war effort in both world wars. I just needed to know where these companies had come from and what happened to them. So the first book looked at where they came from, and the second book, which I called Vehicles to Vaccines, looked at what happened to them, and of course drew me into all sorts of new developments that hadn't been dreamt of at the time of 1945.
Yeah, because I was going to say that the last book, in a sense, was framed by both Great Expositions and two world wars, where so much change was being driven and also being discovered at the same time. I don't think it was purely the wars that brought this about, but we've sort of moved into this different state of change. Yes, there are wars in different places around the world, but not in that same sense. And they're affecting the movement of people, but not necessarily the evolution of manufacturing. And so, yeah, I was sort of fascinated to hear your take on what you feel those eras of change have become, and where those journeys have taken those companies and those people.
Yeah, I think when we look back, it really is a period of 70 years or so. When we look at that first decade, the 1950s, um, oddly, we see British manufacturing doing pretty well. You have to recognize that these companies had busted guts for the war effort up to 1945. There had then been a period of licking wounds, frankly. But then there was this massive challenge of paying the bills. And we had to export like mad in order to pay for the essential imports we needed. And British companies rose to the challenge really admirably. We can think of places like Coventry, which were buzzing in the 50s, with motorcar companies producing fabulous vehicles that the Americans wanted to buy, the Australians wanted to buy. There was tremendous demand in these export markets. But the 50s was also a time where things began to slip. Our major competitors, Germany and Japan, at the beginning of the 50s were really out of the equation. But they entered the equation in a big way, having re-equipped their industry. And so the British were finding themselves competing with modern industries in countries that were determined to succeed. I think there's a sense in which the British had become complacent, and this showed through in a number of industries. There is, of course, always the nagging question of trade union action, or more accurately, unofficial trade union action. I think what happened was in the 50s, because companies were so desperate to export, if unofficial union action made demands for increased pay, they'd just give in to get the lads back to work. And so that vital, creative relationship between management and workforce really never happened, certainly not then. And I think that probably built up problems for the future. from the 50s into the 60s, then you can't help but think of the miniskirts, the Beatles, you know, a nation that really actually was pretty full of confidence. And there were reasons for this confidence. Um, the mini car I've spoken about, fantastic success and took BMC totally by surprise. They did not expect that. Then you have the other wonderful motor cars coming out in the 60s. And here I do give myself away. There is something glorious about the Jaguar E-Type, about the Aston Martin DB5. But then, of course, we have the ships, the QE2. The 60s were, in that sense, a continuation of the positive. But underlying that continuation, there were these problems brewing with complacency, but actually with the other nations doing an awful lot better. Continuing through the decades, the 70s was the double whammy of the two oil crises. And this hit not only the UK, but manufacturing worldwide. I think in the UK, it possibly hit doubly hard, perhaps because management wasn't really geared up to take on crisis management. The 70s, which is really when I began work, virtually the first thing I remember happening was Rolls-Royce. We very, very nearly lost that magnificent company, but mercifully it was saved. We then, of course, entered the EC. And what's interesting about that, and this ignores arguments about Brexit, which I won't go into, that there are a lot of people saying that the big problem of the entry into the EEC was that we went in far too late. Had we gone in at the beginning, we would, along with France and Germany, have been facing competition. And so our manufacturing companies could well have been a good deal sharper than they were in the 70s when we actually went in.
That totally makes sense, and it's almost like the sort of innovation curve of the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority laggards, of almost any product cycle and even rule of a people, of a nation or anything. The politics, the ideas and things, they evolve and change, and yeah, it definitely feels like that there was a perfection of craft. There were very highly skilled craftspeople, but maybe the people looking ahead to what was going to come through and was going to be a cheaper innovation or a different type of innovation or a different demand, um, weren't there. They were leaning on the fact that we have these beautiful crafts, we have these beautiful things, and it was the supply chain to the UK, to the sort of European countries that was being affected by some of these disasters and incidents that happened, that sort of rocked them, and they weren't ready to adapt. And other parts have been able to sort of pick that up or change that. So, I mean, were you seeing new stuff come out, or do you feel that some of this change was just the splintering or the decay or the reflection inside the enterprises and the manufacturing plants in the UK?
I think one of our problems throughout was that we were first off the block. Now, if you look at the railways, um, absolutely no doubt that our steam railways were world beaters. They were stunningly good. The Flying Scotsman, the Mallard, absolutely wonderful, wonderful locomotives. But this delayed our move. And that delay, in fact, and the failure really to go fully electric early on, I think caused huge, huge problems. But there are other areas where we were first off the block and it caused problems. With television, we went for 405 lines early, whereas just over the channel, they adopted 625 right from the start, which meant that they could have bigger screens, which the public wanted. But we were early, and to change over later was expensive. We did have the ideas. I think to say that we were not being inventive would be disingenuous completely. Looking at the pharmaceutical sector in the 60s and the 70s, what they were doing is what I, I personally think manufacturing companies should always do. They were investing until it hurt. So they were investing in research, and research was resulting in new and innovative drugs, which actually took our pharmaceutical industry from um, almost a cottage industry to something that now is world beating. That investment truly paid off because we invested in the people and the resources to make it happen.
Yeah, that's interesting that and that sort of shift that it does take a good deal of manpower and a big sites to produce, but it's not the same type of resource, and sometimes it becomes a bit less. Um, the innovation of producing pharmaceuticals is great, but the consumption of it and the visual presence of it is very different from seeing a Jaguar or a Land Rover or a Rolls Royce moving down the street and feeling like you've created something new that will stand time. It's more transient in a way, the pharmaceuticals.
I think that's right. And or rather, I think that was right. If we just wind back from now, what, 2, 3 years to when COVID was, threatening the most appalling destruction, it was AstraZeneca, the child of ICI, that came up with one of the great vaccines. And that was highly visible and highly commendable.
Be companies, like manufacturers, to build better solutions and drive better sales funnels. So if you would like to build a web application or improve your branding and sales funnel, get in contact today. holdingbay.co.uk or call us on 01273 044 019.
I guess there was a great deal of personal and social change happening with people and what people wanted and what people felt they deserved after the sort of post-war had moved through and you were into the sort of the 70s and 80s and people wanted more consumption and things. I mean, do you think did you find that the business in the UK were able to follow that, or were they being influenced from other parts?
Well, I think probably with consumer goods, um, we weren't quite there, and that gave other nations opportunities. I think one connected area where we most emphatically were there was in construction. We had Pilkington, the St Helens Glass Company, um, recruiting a man, oddly enough, called Alistair Pilkington, but only a distant relation of the then managing family. And he invented float glass. Now, float glass transformed glass production. And as we saw the high rise blocks going up, it was highly visible. It was a dramatically important innovation. Now, there was one comment made by the then chairman of Pilkington when they went public just a few years later. He observed that he thought it very, very unlikely that they would have backed the investment into float glass had they been a public company. And this is a theme, I really probably do bash on about because I feel it quite strongly. If we look at other companies, if we look at JCB, which is a private company, it has done phenomenally well. It has been innovative, both in what it produces, but also where it produces it. It is in many senses world class, but it doesn't have to look over its shoulder at shareholders. My suspicion is Jim Ratcliffe with Ineos might hold the same view, that being a private company gave him the, the freedom to make brave decisions. And it is those brave decisions that have pushed British manufacturing forward. And I think it is the short-termism of the City of London and government indeed that tends to hold it back. That wasn't really answering your question, but I do think it's an extremely important point when we look at manufacturing over the last 70 years.
Being a child of the sort of 70s and 80s, I felt the change in the sort of big industry and things, but I felt that maybe some of the innovation that I certainly said, and maybe it was being a child, that was the attainable one, was there was definite innovation or drive that bicycles and the lighter form of things, the sort of the whole, what's it called, but the rally doors, there was this competition and innovation in this sort of lighter, smaller form, and maybe fitness came into it. That was a sort of jogging and running and things had been picked up as things that people should do, get outside. That did you end up looking into any of the sort of the bicycles or personal modes of travel that were maybe not the same size as a car or a lorry?
Well, I was working in Nottingham at the time, so rally was extremely visible, and what they were doing with bicycles. But thinking of consumer products at the time, of course, we were in the period of the Amstrad, which was incredibly innovative. The Amstrad, the BBC computer, the Acorn, all these. This was great stuff. It was really great stuff. The problem was, of course, that IBM was a bit greater. But these were wonderful products to have in your home. I remember with huge affection my first Amstrad.
Oh, and same. And that was the innovation that was coming through, wasn't it? I mean, we were moving away from wires and valves inside devices. That there were PCBs, there were microchips. Things were able to be shrunk down and delivered. In somewhat rugged cases, or somewhat sometimes flimsy cases, or power supplies that were not necessarily the best for devices that were going to be run and used as much as they may not have imagined people were going to adopt these things, or even mobile devices like Walkmans and things, of people being able to move around with them. The computer innovation and certainly that sort of that startup feel from the UK. There was many, the Sinclair and the Amstrad things. There was many small innovative companies. They didn't necessarily scale as far as they might, but they became big companies at the time.
And we shouldn't forget some of the bigger ones, because some of the bigger ones were doing really great work. Marconi, part of GEC, was doing fabulous work with semiconductors. I spoke to a former finance director of the Marconi operation in Lincoln, and he told me that they put a plan to Arnold Weinstock for the mass production of semiconductors, and they fully believed that it was achievable. But Weinstock decided against it. And who knows whether it was succeeded or not, but there was the ambition there. And of course, they have gone on to produce very complex semiconductors that do compete well in the world market. And we can think of Plessey. Plessey, I think, was an extremely technically competent company. And they still, a distant offshoot of Plessey, still do produce semiconductors down in Plymouth. They were around at the time. Thorn, before it came EMI, I think, undertook production of semiconductors. but possibly not with the enthusiasm of some of the other companies.
Hmm. I was just thinking while you were talking, there were some names that I know, but I'm not so familiar with their histories. But the Acorn computers and BBC getting behind that for getting computers into schools and into homes. Um, there was that piece of the computer will change the world, but we're not quite sure exactly how yet. But we're going to help people and put it at a price point that people can adopt these things. So
Continue to make computer technology accessible, to interested people, whatever their age. So I think still doing it.
and even maybe the slightly more outlandish of Sinclair moving into electronic vehicles, but maybe slightly ahead of their time with their C5 that understood. Some people have even been picking back up again in recent times to pick up the antique models and get them up and rolling again as somewhat of a novelty.
Yeah, I think they have.
But I mean, back to sort of a larger change and things. I mean, do you feel that there's obviously the uncertainty and change out there, but were any of these things of sort of nationalization, privatization, these financial crises, pandemics, and things? Do you think they also galvanized any sort of larger or more change that we've been benefiting from since then, or it's sort of more splintered the market into uncertainty?
Yeah, I can't say that I can see evidence of them galvanizing. I think privatization for manufacturing was pretty disastrous. It just opened up the British market to foreign companies, which for the British has been a long way from helpful. And it could have been avoided with planning, with a bit of foresight. British manufacturing could have been in the right shape to take on the challenge before the cold wind of privatization blew through. I think that would have been possible, but it didn't happen.
The short term gains rather than a longer term view. It seemed to be maybe a problem of for many sectors that Britain doesn't have the appetite for investment, or not in our shores. There are many British entrepreneurs who are out there investing or helping other countries or other regions grow, or other plants for their business. But there seems to be this sort of scale ceiling for many companies that they then merge or get acquired from other shores.
Yeah, no, I find that both difficult to understand and very sad. You spoke of companies investing abroad, and Weir Group, which is a fabulous British engineering company that dates way back, but it is now predominantly invested overseas. It I think consciously decided to move away from the energy sector into mining. And inevitably, given that there's not a great deal to mine in this country, it works overseas. And it does good things overseas. It has a great apprenticeship program. It certainly champions the place of women in the workplace. It does good things, but doesn't do those good things where I like it to.
Okay, so we sort of got up to sort of 80s, 90s, and so with our sort of timeline. I mean, do you feel there's been a next era or next set of innovation or growth in this space?
Area, I think, obviously it becomes difficult to see because it's too recent. Um, but the waters are also muddied, I think, for other reasons. If we take the 90s, so probably when New Labour came in, although I think it could well have started before then. The saviour for the British economy was seen to be a combination of retail and financial services. And so I think government lost interest in manufacturing. It didn't necessarily do anything particularly damaging to it, but it didn't do anything particularly encouraging. But in spite of that, I think good things continued to happen. Interestingly, I think in the relationship of industry and the universities, I think the discovery and development of new materials, and I'm thinking of graphene and the like, I think that was an interesting and exciting innovation in those later years. We've spoken about Acorn already, but the child of Acorn, ARM, ARM, was producing the operating software for most of the world's handheld devices. This is phenomenal. This is absolutely crazily important. And that all happened, I think, when government really took its eye off the ball. So industry can do it. I just feel it could probably do it an awful lot better with a supportive government and a supportive financial sector.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I mean, I guess that was seen with some of the innovation that's been happening towards space and space telescopes, and back to the pharma, where the UK was collaborating with the sort of European partners and the European investment, which has now got to sort of rethink itself, or is it in, is it out? But there's certainly that sort of reinvigoration of how far can we see in space and how far can we see back in time. There was definitely driving from the UK as part of that move. So yeah, we've been sort of looking inside the world and out, but it's not quite the same radical innovation. Maybe until we get to, say, electric cars, which I mean, they've been around for longer, but we probably consider they're a fairly recent innovation. But that's again that sort of that battery technology and the miniaturization of digital technology being more and more in engineering type products, not them just being purely sort of raw materials, for want of a better word.
And I find, I think the electric car debate is very interesting. I find myself drawn increasingly towards hydrogen, and excited about what JCB are doing with hydrogen-powered diggers. I think it is a technology that has advantages over the battery, because I think we're beginning to see that there are a lot of, not least infrastructure issues of some magnitude with a big move over to electric cars.
But it's proving a big move to the way the plants are set up and what is needed and the skill sets are needed. So that the thing that it's also driving to the end of is it seems that maybe and maybe that comes back to your comments on the government of this less interest in manufacturing also means there's less people picking it up as a trade and going into it, which then probably leads into a cycle that you would get these sort of wonderfully professional and wonderfully craft led people who are producing these great products, but maybe they're staying a very long time in industry, and we need to find these ways of getting these younger people excited, even though there are these sort of newer technologies that people are flocking to purchase. But hopefully we can see that era comes through of people wanting to get their hands dirty and work with in the sense of getting in there and seeing what can they do and what can they approve, what can they innovate on and drive us forward.
Well, in that context, I can be unashamedly in my advertising for the city in which I worked for many years, Lincoln. because obviously it is a city with a long industrial and manufacturing and engineering heritage. And the current stock of manufacturing companies decided 10, 15 years ago to put on an annual exhibition of engineering in the cathedral, which is itself a masterpiece of engineering. And so what is known as the Spark Festival takes place annually. And this inspires young people. The neighbouring university technical college gets involved. And I spoke at the Spark Festival this last summer to talk about the key, what I saw were the keys to the success of British manufacturing. And I followed, and I was followed by a remarkable young man who had come to the Spark, I think probably the first or second Spark Festival, and he'd gone from there to the UTC and on to Reed Engineering at the University of Lincoln, and now has his own company manufacturing 3D printers. And I went to see his factory. Small, but my goodness, it's exciting. And his whole approach to manufacturing is exciting. So I think there's a lot of hope. He's, I would say, possibly not necessarily the sort of guy you would have expected to see in a manufacturing context. You'd almost expected him to see doing something artistic. But there he was, doing fabulous work with 3D printers. Very exciting.
And it concentrates us down into the small and gets us back into one of the things we had a conversation on last time on the sort of the chemistry or that sort of lowest part of these things of which type of material is going to be best for this. You can change out the material. You're working with different filaments and different pieces. Been at trade show this week. They're ironing in carbon fiber to their 3D printing to add more rigidity and more strength to the pieces. So there's this sort of collaboration of different very small and very detailed chemistry, which is coming through in the other parts too. Maybe the sort of battery technology, maybe other things which are they're the raw elements, and the world's been seeing that that finding these elements or seeing where these are coming from is becoming more and more important, as much as the supply chain of the finished goods. Do you think that may be the area that's going to see the next rounds of innovation of people either making new products or new new materials or coming through that space? Or where would you see, as we're coming to the end of the interview, where what's leading the way, you feel, for the next 20, 50 years of who knows where?
Well, that's right. I think it is the whole area of collaboration. We do things so much better when we don't do it alone. Absolutely no question of that. British industry suffered dreadfully for decades by the fact that our universities thought that factories were beneath them. Thank goodness that has changed. And we do have active collaboration between academia and industry. But we do need the cross-border collaboration as well. And in the field of new materials, it is about the graphene guys coming together with the silicon guys and seeing what they can produce. All these things are trial and error. ICI became a brilliant, brilliant company because their founding directors could see that they had to back pure research. They had to give these guys the space to experiment, to discover things. And of course, out of that came polythene and perspex, neither of which were intended, but both of which were world changing.
Feels a great note to leave the sort of history conversation on. And just to then round out the end of our show, do you, what's your next areas of study, or the things that you've been working on that you are passionate about after this round of research?
What I'm doing at the moment is, having looked at the story of the last 70 years, sector by sector, I'm now digging down into places to see where the manufacturing happened. And I'm hoping out of that, I will discover a little bit of the why it happened there. And that also might be helpful, might provide some helpful pointers for the future.
Interesting. Sort of overlaying the map of the where with the what, and maybe the future one after that is the why, um, or maybe that is sort of triangulated by the other two.
Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't give us our fun closure of putting you in back out in the superhero costume, or should you maybe want to give the superhero costume to the general public of we're standing on top of the mountain and we want to get to the next one, and what superpower are we going to use to help move ourselves or our community, our product, over to the next leap, the next innovation. Would you like to pick a superpower or a thing that you would grab and pick up to take you on your journey?
There is absolutely no doubt what my superpower would be. The existential threat we face is global warming. Let us be in absolutely no doubt about that. So if I had a superpower that enabled me to crack that one, I would die a happy man.
Yeah, a great area, great innovation that would be. Um, and I would enjoy seeing this on your face. Though, let's push the further date way out into the future. So, for people who've enjoyed this conversation and want to read a bit more on vehicles and vaccines, where's the best place to pick up a copy or learn more about your work?
It is available on Amazon, and it is in a Kindle paperback and hardback form. And of course, visit my website at www.britishmanufacturinghistory.uk, and you will find my latest thinking.
No, that's brilliant. Um, uh, so I thank you again for joining us today and taking us on a history tour, bringing us more up into the present, and challenging the listeners to partake in forming that next sets of innovation, and take us on the next journey.
No, great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us again on this episode of the Cliff Notes podcast, where we ask the leader and founder way. If you'd like to get in touch with myself or the guests, feel free to reach out on the website cliffnotespodcast.com, or across the socials. We always like to hear people's feedback and what they've been doing, and we look forward to speaking again soon.